Howdy folks, hope you've all had a good weekend and welcome back to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. And actually I've got a whole bunch of things that I wanted to talk about this week. And as luck would have it, because, well, you know, hot topics are hot topics, I was interviewed by the Rank Amateur podcast on Friday. Now, the podcast should be up now. I'll put a link in the video description to those of you who wish to check out the podcast. If it's not available at this precise moment, that's almost certainly going to be my fault. I'll have just mistimed the publication of this episode of Mingles with Jingles. Stick around for half an hour or so. The podcast should be there if it isn't already up. The thing is, well, I had a bunch of things written down to talk about in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, all the current hot topics and things like World of Warships. And, well, unsurprisingly, the Rank Amateur podcast wanted to talk about all of the latest hot topics in things like World of Warships. So a lot of the stuff that I'm covering in this episode of Mingles with Jingles has covered in far greater detail in the Rank Amateur podcast, because an episode of Mingles typically lasts between 20 and 25 minutes, but the podcast is 57 minutes. So by all means, stick around until the end of this episode of Mingles with Jingles, and then maybe go and check out the podcast to get some slightly more in-depth discussion on a lot of the subjects that I'm going to be talking about in Mingles. Or if you prefer, don't bother watching the rest of this episode of Mingles and just go and check out the podcast instead. Whatever floats your boat. One thing that I didn't discuss on the podcast was something that I brought up in last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, a good couple of weeks or perhaps even as much as a month after it happened. YouTube and YouTube Shorts, and how YouTube have just decided that they're going to give away your copyright to, well, anybody who wants it. And didn't, because their YouTube think that this was something that was worth mentioning to all of the hundreds of thousands of YouTube content creators out there. Well, as many of you pointed out, and I should stress this, as many of you pointed out, YouTube didn't bother telling me. Hey, at least they're consistent. YouTube recently got around to covering their arses on this one, and you can now bulk edit all of your videos in the Creator Studio section of YouTube and opt out of just, voluntarily giving up your copyright to anybody who fancies taking advantage of it. So that's good. But once again, it wasn't YouTube who told me this. It was you guys, so thank you for that. Well, anyway, moving on to what I guess is probably going to be the hot topic for the week for most of us. World of Warships just announced the introduction of Russian aircraft carriers. Well, technically I suppose they're Soviet aircraft carriers. And everybody went crazy, and not in a good way. I think the first thing that everybody said was, yeah, that's just what everybody's been asking for, isn't it? More aircraft carriers, more aircraft. That's just what the game needs right now. Now, I don't think I've seen this from any official source, but it is understood, because several people, certainly on the Russian server, have, and again, I don't want to say confirmed, but several people have attested that the reason why we're getting Russian aircraft carriers, or why they've been announced, is because of Russian Navy Day. Right. Apparently, this is a good enough reason to announce the introduction of a whole line of aircraft carriers that never existed, instead of, French aircraft carriers that did. This was another fairly common complaint in response to the news that we were getting Soviet aircraft carriers. And I have to admit, while I'm not against introducing paper ships on principle, I mean, there are enough of them in the game anyway, and it's fun, or it can be fun, to play What If with stuff that was at least prototyped on paper. An entire line of things that never existed beyond sketches on the back of napkins is really, taking the piss a little. Especially when there are plenty of other ships that did exist that still haven't made it into the game, like, French aircraft carriers maybe? I can't believe that I'm actually sitting here in a position where I'm arguing for the introduction of more aircraft carriers. But that's just how ridiculous this whole thing is. Well, anyway, once I'd had a chance to get over my initial outrage, calm down a bit, take a step back, take a deep breath, and assess the whole announcement again, a couple of things did become apparent that might mean that this whole thing isn't going to be quite as bad as it initially sounds. just because wargaming are introducing new aircraft carriers doesn't mean we're going to see more aircraft. We're going to see different types of aircraft carriers being played by the same aircraft carrier players. If you don't like aircraft carriers and you don't play aircraft carriers, you're not going to suddenly just start playing them because there are Russian ones. Although that may not necessarily be true on the Russian server, where you may find that people who have never played an aircraft carrier before in their lives may suddenly start trying them out, purely out of national pride. But I don't play on the Russian server, so I don't give a shit. That's not going to affect me, and it shouldn't affect any of you. Unless you play on the Russian server, in which case, unlucky. But for the rest of us, we're not, or we shouldn't see greater numbers of aircraft carriers in the matchmaking queue, because the people who play carriers aren't going to be able to play the Shikaku and their Admiral Nakhimov at the same time, are they? They have to pick and choose. So there shouldn't be more carriers. And because of the gimmick of these Soviet carriers, we might actually end up seeing less aircraft. Because the thing with these Soviet carriers is each squadron launched only gets one attack, not anything up to 3 attacks, depending on whether or not they survive any anti-aircraft fire. And let's face it, most of the time they do. So that, in combination with the fact that, at least at the moment, the aircraft are going to have medium to slow cruising speed and low hit points, means that instead of launching one strike and having it lurking around and conducting multiple attacks, the Russian or Soviet carriers are going to be launching one strike and then having to execute the attack as quickly as possible and then launch a fresh squadron. So you may actually end up, if there are more Russian carriers in the games that you're playing, seeing less aircraft overall. The intention is that these Soviet aircraft are going to have low cruise speed and low hit point pools, but they're going to be able to drop their weapons from further out. So any Soviet attack squadrons that stick around too long trying to drop their weapons as close as possible are just going to get shredded by anti-aircraft fire. And the ones that don't get close enough to take casualties from anti-aircraft fire, that you should have a lot more warning and therefore a much better chance of dodging. Hopefully it's not going to end up like the old Hakuryu stealth bombing thing. There was a brief period when the Hakuryu was just ridiculously overpowered. With the right combination of skills and equipment, you could get some extremely long-range torpedo drops off from the Hakuryu. Such long-range torpedo drops, in fact, that if you timed it right, you'd only actually be spotted by the ships you were torpedoing for the briefest fraction of a second as you dropped the torpedoes and then recalled the squadron. You'd be chugging along in your Montana, and then if you were paying attention, you might see the icon flash up. Ooh, I'm spotted by aircraft. Look around. Don't see any aircraft. Oh, I'm not spotted by aircraft anymore. Don't know what that was all about. Then a minute and a half later, these waves of torpedoes would just appear out of nowhere. So yeah, that was fun. Hopefully they can avoid getting into that kind of situation. It is obviously going to require some balancing, and the initial concept may not survive testing, but I hope so, because it sounds like, well, more fun for the people who aren't in the aircraft carriers. So, I mean, yeah, Russian carriers, fine, whatever. But the concept behind them doesn't seem to be completely terrible. Actually, you know, it just occurs to me, despite the warning at the beginning that I was only going to be talking about things in this episode of Mingles that I'd already talked about in the Rank Amateur podcast, it occurs to me that this is actually the only thing that I'm talking about in this episode of Mingles that I also discussed in the Rank Amateur podcast. So go check out the Rank Amateur podcast. There's going to be at least 40 minutes there talking about stuff that I didn't talk about in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. So yeah, once again, link down below in the video description. Meanwhile, I can't remember exactly why I was doing it. I was going through my backlog of YouTube videos, and I got back as far as 2018, and there was a War Thunder video. I can't remember the exact date, but it was somewhere in 2018. It was my War Thunder Back to the Future Part 2 video. And as has become fairly standard in my War Thunder videos, because I upload them so infrequently, I made a joke about, welcome to your annual War Thunder video. And well, I think this was the first time I started cracking the Star Citizen jokes. Welcome to your annual War Thunder video. It's 2021 and Star Citizen is still in alpha. Because, I thought the idea of Star Citizen still not being out of alpha after another 3 years was ridiculous enough to be funny. Meanwhile, in 2021, and I thought I was joking at the time. Seriously, I am not actually making this up. This is real life. This is not a fantasy. My God. Oh well, never mind. I'm sure it's going to be great when it does eventually see the light of day. Well, Star Citizen is pretty great right now, as long as it works. I was having a chat with my friend Roy, who, as a direct result of my Star Citizen Invictus Week video, actually went ahead, pledged, downloaded the client, and started having a go at Star Citizen himself. He's not happy with me. I mean, he's loving it, but it can be incredibly annoying. For example, he took his Aurora out, exploring, found himself a planet he liked the look of, landed, went out, explored, came back and his ship had gone. He was... Welcome to the Star Citizen Alpha. That's just the way things are around here. I mean, and I am sure that it is going to be absolutely fantastic when it's eventually released. I have no idea what decade that's going to be. I would be extremely surprised if we saw anything, released in a playable state this side of 2025. There is a new patch coming out soon. I haven't actually looked at the patch notes, but they are making progress, just, very, very slowly. There was actually something else that we discussed in the podcast, and it was something that I did touch on last week when I was talking about the introduction of submarines into a game that's already flooded with multiple different classes and types of warship, and this was a worst case scenario, but you could have a match with 12 ships on each side, because that's the limit, where both teams may have 3 submarines, 4 destroyers, 2 aircraft carriers, which leaves only 3 slots for battleships and cruisers. And then, if we want to really make it a worst case scenario, all of those battleships and cruisers could be hybrids with, aircraft of their own. Yeah, it could happen. And if it could happen, it will happen. And then, of course, you also have to take into consideration that, well, I say only 3 slots for battleships and cruisers, but cruisers aren't just cruisers. You've got heavy cruisers, you've got light cruisers, and now you've got the proliferation of super cruisers or battle cruisers or whatever the hell you want to call them, things like the Stalingrad, the Kronstadt, and so on and so on and so on. Really big cruisers with really big guns. And that got me thinking. And so on Friday morning, just as an experiment, I went and had a look through my video folder. All of the World of Warships replays that I have video of, but I haven't actually gotten around to editing or adding commentary to them yet, and I just took a look at the ships involved in the matchmaking. Because I'd said, when they get around to introducing submarines, the matchmaking is going to be incredibly crowded. You may end up with a situation where there's only 3 slots for battleships and cruisers. But then I'm looking through the matchmaking of games that are already being played, and we're already starting to see this happen with aircraft carriers, battleships, hybrid battleships, heavy cruisers, super cruisers, hybrid cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers. And this is before we introduce submarines, and I'm looking through these replays. Nobody's playing light cruisers anymore, already. You see them at tier 6 and below, because people, if they're playing cruisers at tier 6 and below, usually don't have the choice to play anything but light cruisers. But once you get to tier 7 and higher, there are very few people choosing to play light cruisers anymore. You get to tier 10, you may see the occasional Minotaur, but I can't remember the last time I saw anybody in, for example, a Worcester. Nobody's playing light cruisers, and you can't really blame them. You've got battleships that delete them as soon as look at them, heavy cruisers that delete them as soon as look at them, super cruisers that delete them as soon as look at them, destroyers that can, torpedo them and delete them as soon as look at them, aircraft carriers that can't really delete them as soon as look at them, but do keep them spotted so that everybody else can delete them as soon as look at them. Hardly anybody's playing light cruisers at high tier, and this is before they introduce submarines and make it even worse. And here's another thing, again going back to the worst case scenario in the matchmaking when we do get submarines. So say we have 3 submarines, 4 destroyers, 2 aircraft carriers, and then 2 battleships and a cruiser. Submarines don't have a lot of health. This is the same issue that they were seeing in World of Tanks, when you used to be able to get 4 artillery per match. And people were cursing, not just because they had to play in a match with 4 artillery per team, but the fact that the artillery was there, taking up things like, heavy tank, tank destroyer and medium tank slots, meant that there was little opportunity to do high damage. And it's the same in World of Warships. I mean, destroyers have, at tier 10, 20 to 25,000 health. There are exceptions and outliers. Tier 10 submarines only have about 15,000 health. So, potentially, we're looking at increasingly rare situations where you even have the potential to do monster damage in a game. 250, 300, 350,000 damage. The upper limit to the potential amount of damage that you can do in a match, even if you play exceptionally well, is, well, it's not much. And then, of course, you get into a game with double carriers, and carriers have a lot of health. Tier 10 carriers have a lot of health. But, well, you can't find the little buggers to kill them, even when they're on the losing team. Because it's almost suicide to go after them. Even if you can find them to shoot at them, they're hiding behind islands or running for the border and running down the match timer. So that's another source of potential damage that is usually just out of reach. So, yeah. It's rarely just as simple when you're looking at a game like World of Warships that was actually very, very simple way back in the day when you only had Americans and Japanese, and the Americans didn't have battleships and the Japanese didn't have aircraft carriers. You could add something new and balance it very, very easily because there wasn't that much of a delicate ecosystem in the game to upset. But obviously, as the game gets older and older, and as more and more things get introduced, new nations with their own gimmicks, new lines with their own gimmicks, every time you introduce something new with its own gimmick, it has to be balanced against everything that preceded it, the 5 years the game's been running. And that's impossible to do. So of course we end up with an imbalanced game. It's not possible to balance something as diverse and varied as World of Warships has become. I mean, they ran out this problem in World of Tanks years ago. So it is an issue, and no, I don't have any easy solutions. And I certainly don't envy wargaming. I mean, they kind of have painted themselves into a corner with this one. I mean, this is very much a problem of their own making. But you do have to feel a certain amount of sympathy for them nonetheless, because whenever they introduce a new premium, or a new nation, or a new line of ships from an existing nation, if they make them too much like everything that's gone before, they get accused of just cutting and pasting. Like, for example, let's say the Commonwealth or the Pan-Asian lines of destroyers or cruisers, which were mostly just versions of existing ships, British and American stuff that were sold off as surplus. And then they get accused of just copying and pasting existing British and American ships. But if they do try to do something different, something with their own gimmick, it just makes it so much more difficult for them to balance it against everything that existed previously. So I certainly don't envy the task before wargaming, because it's virtually impossible for them to balance everything that's in the game. Because regardless of how hard they may try to ensure that everything stays balanced, there are always going to be outliers, unforeseen circumstances, like the Hakuryu long-range stealth torpedo drops, which were briefly a thing. Things like that just emerge. Things that maybe they couldn't have predicted, that didn't pop up during testing, and players figured out for themselves, if I take this and that, I put this captain on with these skills, ooh, look what we can do. So then that has to be addressed. Some kind of nerf has to happen, but you have to be careful to nerf just that one specific circumstance and hope that whatever it is that you do to nerf it doesn't affect the ship in other circumstances. And even when you get it right, or you think you've gotten it right, and everything's fine, 6 months later you introduce, I don't know, Italian cruisers with semi-armor piercing ammunition. And then that exposes deficiencies in other areas that you couldn't possibly have taken into consideration, because when you balance them, semi-armor piercing shells weren't a thing. And then a year later, submarines, and the whole thing happens again every time you introduce something new. And you might find that with the introduction of Russian aircraft carriers with long-range torpedo and skip bomber drops, that we suddenly see a resurgence in the popularity and actual usefulness of long-range anti-aircraft fire. You never know, the Atlanta might not be shit anymore. But anybody who doesn't have long-range AA might be in a lot of trouble. I mean, like I say, when the game's been around as long as World of Warships has, with so many radically different moving parts, one thing rarely just changes one thing. It usually has all kinds of repercussions all the way back down the line that you have to take into consideration, but which often isn't obvious until thousands and thousands of people start playing it and complaining very, very loudly. And of course we should, because while we can appreciate how difficult this sort of thing must be to balance, that doesn't mean we don't have the right to complain about it when they get it wrong. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we've given you something to talk about or think about. And I do encourage you to go and check out the Rank Amateur podcast, where we talk about some of these subjects in much, much greater detail. Link down below in the video description. Meanwhile, as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.